Hello, and welcome to the Sound on Sound People and Music Industry podcast channel with me, Nick Rothwell. In this episode, I talk to Andrew McPherson, head of the Augmented Instruments Laboratory, the developers of the Bela open source audio maker platform, and inventor of the Magnetic Resonator Piano, which is a piano augmented to generate infinite sustain, harmonics, pitch bend, and new timbres totally acoustically. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us here on the Sound on Sound podcast, where we're going to talk about, I guess, a bit of audio processing and some stuff about instruments, instrument design, and whatever comes up in the next 20 minutes, half hour or so. So why don't we start by you just giving us a kind of a potted CV, your education, your background, and how you got to where you are now.
Thanks very much for having me here. I am a professor in the Dyson School of Design Engineering at Imperial College London, where I lead a group called the Augmented Instruments Laboratory. By training, I'm a composer, an electronic engineer, and a researcher in human-computer interaction. And I guess over the last 10-15 years, I've been combining these interests in the sort of service of designing new digital musical instruments, things that have elements connected to long-standing musical traditions, but also to new forms of musical practice. So I originally came from MIT, where I did a double major in music and electrical engineering. I then did a PhD in music composition at the University of Pennsylvania, a postdoc at Drexel University, and for 10 years or so, I was an academic at Queen Mary University of London in their Center for Digital Music, and I moved to Imperial last year at the beginning of 2023.
Okay, so I've got to admit that prior to, let's say, a week ago, I didn't know much about your work, with the exception of the Bela board, which I've come across a few times over the last few years. So I don't know whether that's a good place to start, or whether there's some kind of a work you've done before that. Like I see TouchKeys goes back about 10 years. Would you say that's kind of the start of this particular body of work, or does it go back before that?
Well, if you want to go back to the beginning, the first instrument is one that's still current in my work, which is the Magnetic Resonator Piano. This is an augmented acoustic instrument, so it is literally an acoustic grand piano, inside of which have been placed electromagnets that make the strings vibrate even when they're not struck by the hammers. So the idea with the MRP is that you can have all of the traditional piano techniques that you would normally have, but that you can also make notes sustain indefinitely by bowing them with the magnets. And it also lets you shape the sound of each note. For example, you can play crescendos, you can play pitch bends, harmonics, new timbres. There's a whole additional vocabulary that comes out of the instrument. But because it is still an acoustic piano, the sound production is still acoustic. You don't need speakers. It's just coming from the strings and the soundboard. So that was the first project for me. I built that at the end of my PhD in 2009. And here we are 15 years later. It's still going. There's dozens of pieces that have been written for this instrument, hundreds of performances. I've started to make more copies of this instrument as people have commissioned them, so that there can be other instruments out there, so that when people write pieces or they want to perform with them, that it's possible for that kind of repertoire and community to emerge. So yeah, that was the first major project that I did in musical instrument design, and it's kind of gone on from there.
Yeah, so I was looking at that, and there's some nice videos and recordings online, and it sounds absolutely gorgeous. And I guess what surprised me about it, maybe it shouldn't have been surprising, but the fact that it is still an acoustic instrument, so it's not like some of these guitarists' infinite sustain effects, which record the audio and then loop them, or do some kind of electronic processing. It is actually using the strings of the piano in the same way that the strings are used when you play an ordinary piano. So in that sense, it's not an electronic instrument at all. It is an acoustic augmentation of a piano via electronic means.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a certain kind of authenticity to the sound actually being produced acoustically. You know that it is literally these strings in front of you that are vibrating to produce that sound. You could reach your hand in, you could stop the strings with your hand if you wanted to. And it gives it a kind of tactile quality, a kind of three-dimensional quality that I think you don't get with a lot of digital processing or any electronic processing. And there's also a way that this kind of physical system, this resonant box that has been, whose design has evolved over so many centuries to become what it is, it surprises you in different ways. It kind of throws things back. You try to put signals into the strings with the electromagnets, but what actually comes back isn't quite what you put in, and that's the beauty of it. If it was just a fancy speaker, then you could do things a lot more cheaply and a lot more simply, but it's this kind of cooperation and sometimes a sort of friction between the acoustic elements of the instrument and the new digital ones that really gives it the character that it has.
I guess there's also some creative constraint here. If you're doing DSP here, you could go nuts and do all sorts of things, but the fact that you're using the strings as sound generators means you can't do that, so you are still working with the kind of the essence of a piano in a way, and it doesn't kind of stray too far from that.
It's absolutely true, and I think that constraints are incredibly important in the design and the use of any instrument. I mean, the idea that we would have one generic instrument that could do anything, I mean, aside from not really being possible, I think if you could do that, it'd actually be really boring. And so, yeah, the fact that the piano really forces you to do certain things and not other things, I think, is really important. And what I've found is early on, when I was exploring this, I thought, well, what happens if you put this kind of sound into the strings? What if you do that? Can you play a recording into the strings? What does that sound like? And what you quickly find is that there's a whole space of things that just, they're just not that effective, or they're just not that interesting. But actually the things that really work, oftentimes are really kind of crude and really basic sounds. You put them into this electromagnet, and then that goes through this acoustic system, and what comes out is somehow, has become sort of magic in some strange way. And you really struggle to explain why that is, but you have to work with those constraints, and the constraints are really important for the design, and the constraints are also really important for composing and performing with it.
Okay, I'm kind of thinking I did now whether anybody's done a prepared piano as part of the resonator piano. Would that make sense, or was that just a bit too crazy?
I'm sure it could be done. I mean, what I think of is, when you think of the cage prepared piano, actually what it is it's the percussion of the piano with the resonance changed. That's why, you put rubber mutes or, steel bolts or something in the strings, and you still have all of the percussive action of the instrument, but with a different kind of sound, a different timbre. And this is sort of the conceptual opposite in a way. It is the resonance, the natural resonance of the strings, but detached from the sound of the felt striking the strings. So, in principle, I guess you could do both. You could put other objects into the strings as well, change the resonance, and then somehow excite those new resonances. It'd be a little bit tricky because I'm not actually setting up feedback loops in this instrument, so it's not really listening to where the strings are tuned. You have to kind of know where the strings are tuned, and then you configure it so that it plays in an effective way. So if you prepare the piano, then there would be a whole extra kind of step of thinking, okay, what does this sound like now, and how can we get those new modes to really speak? It'd be interesting to try.
Mm-hmm. But you are picking out harmonics, I noticed. So I'm curious, how much work did it take to actually get this thing to work? It sounds like it's kind of very highly tuned to exactly where the harmonics of the strings are. I mean, is it down to kind of very minute, detailed placement of the electromagnets, or what?
I think it sort of depends on what you're looking for out of it. It's a lot more robust than I might have expected when I first set out. I had a whole bunch of things that I tried to do in the early days, try to come up with some sort of phase lock loop that would precisely tune the magnet into where the string wanted to ring. And as I went along, I found out you don't really need a whole lot of that, to be honest. You put in signals that are kind of more or less where the strings are tuned, or one of the harmonics, and it just kind of sings, and it just works. Now, you can detune it a bit, in fact, and that turns out to be really interesting for reasons I still can't entirely explain. The strings sort of fight back in a way, so it does bend the pitch, but also kind of warbles a bit, and that it gives it a certain sort of character. But on the other hand, if you're trying to do something that is like a kind of digitally precise sort of acoustic synthesizer of some sort, where you can guarantee that the seventh harmonic of this string is going to sound exactly as loud as the ninth harmonic of that other one, that's really variable. It depends on the piano. It depends on where the magnets are. So it's like going from one instrument to another of any acoustic instrument. They all have their own characters. They're slightly different. You get to know the kind of things that are consistent and the things that are not, and you just work with that as a musician.
Mm-hmm. So I've got to mention, just for the sake of completeness, TouchKeys, given that Sound on Sound covered those 10 years ago now. So that's similar in the sense that you're sensing keys being played and sensing continuous gesture there. But that is what? It's a USB MIDI device that just generates aftertouch and pressure and just data signals then feed into whatever synth, whatever sound source you're using, presumably.
Yeah. So TouchKeys was where I went next after the MRP, and there I was really concerned with how this notions of sort of detailed and nuanced control could be applied to a MIDI keyboard. So the idea is touch sensors that go on the surface of an existing keyboard. So you keep the familiar action, you keep all that familiar technique, but then you also have these extra degrees of freedom by moving the fingers around on the key surface. It's a USB device. It plugs into your computer. There's some software that runs on the computer. It aggregates the signals from the touch sensor and from the keyboard that the sensors are installed on. And then you get various mappings that you can choose, that you can add things like vibrato, pitch bends, swells to the synths that you have to control. So the acoustic element isn't in that, but it's intended in a different musical context. And I guess for me that's one of the things that is important in the work that I do in the lab, is just that every technology is matched to a certain kind of musical context that makes sense, and that you really think about what are musicians trying to do in this area, and how can we build something that kind of speaks a language that they already understand, but also brings something new to the table, because there's plenty of gear that you can buy already. We don't need more gear for gear's sake. That really everything should have a reason for existence.
And I guess the TouchKeys is kind of working in the same space as Roly with their Keywaves, their phone-based instruments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually, the C-board and TouchKeys were released, I think, within about a year of one another, actually, and and those aren't the only ones either. It's actually really interesting to see all the different controllers and new instruments that are in that space, and I'm always interested to see the new things that come out, and because I'm just a big believer in sort of nuance and detail, I think the things that set TouchKeys apart, sort of in terms of the ideas that I had to begin with, the reason I did it the way I did, was to try to stay as close as possible to a familiar keyboard technique, even if that meant sacrificing certain kinds of techniques that might be possible on other physical interfaces. And I guess that's just, that's again a recurring thread in my work, is the idea that instruments should connect to some kind of existing musical skills or to some sort of communities or aesthetics, but then also extend that in some way.
And I guess also, to put it fairly bluntly, TouchKeys and Resonator Piano are kind of aimed at different parts of the market. One part is those who have actual real pianos, and the other part is those who have MIDI keyboards that might want to augment their digital or their synthesized music composition skills and performance.
Yeah, totally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's it's different communities. It's it's different markets really, and it's different musical aesthetics as well.
Okay, so coming back to the Resonator Piano for a moment, one thing that I find interesting about all these kinds of instruments is it's one thing to build the instrument, but what's also important is to kind of build the ecosystem and the community around it. And it seems to me that with the Resonator Piano, you also are trying to build this in terms of finding artists who want to experiment with this and, I guess, helping them get material recorded, performed, and building up a kind of a repertoire that kind of establishes the Resonator Piano as a kind of a real instrument with some kind of pedigree to it. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's absolutely fair, and it goes back to the very early days of the instrument. So when I first built this, I was doing a PhD in music composition, and so in a lot of ways I was building for myself, not to play because I'm not a great pianist, but to compose for. But I think if I'd stopped there, it probably wouldn't have been that interesting. The thing that really changed everything was then starting to work with other composers. First, a group of 6 composers in Philadelphia, and kind of from there, now a few dozen more. And artists from a number of different musical traditions, and everybody kind of finds something new in the instrument, and everybody has their own take on it, which is super interesting. But then also you see that people learn from one another. So somebody who comes in now to use the instrument, they're not just influenced by whatever demo I might give or whatever videos I might have put online, but also the other pieces that have been written, the other performances that have been done. And I think that's really important. That's that these communities can form and can grow in that way. But it certainly takes a lot of facilitation work to do that kind of thing, because for a lot of years it was really just me carting around these really heavy cases and installing them in different pianos, with varying reactions from the local piano technicians sometimes, and there was a risk, I think, as the project went on, that my own time and my own availability would ultimately become the sort of ball and chain that prevented this instrument from kind of sustaining a community. Because if I personally have to be there every time any performance is done anywhere in the world, obviously that doesn't scale. And so that's why after a lot of years of having just one or two of these instruments around, just in the last couple of years I've started to look at building more and making it possible to actually produce these at some kind of modest scale. And it's really in a way about kind of letting it sort of fly free a bit, and for people to be able to take ownership and do their own things with it.
So do you have any kind of sense of what kind of body of work may be built by this? I mean, I'm hoping it's not just, lots and lots of ambient sustained piano albums, but will kind of spread into, or kind of flower into a more varied set of musical genres.
Oh, it absolutely is, and in fact, it already is. It kind of naturally tends toward a certain kind of a droney sound. It's very compelling, but in some ways, some of the most interesting work has been stuff that either has combined this with traditional pianism, so that you can get quite, a lot of activity out of the traditional hammer mechanism, or which has kind of looked for the kind of cracks and almost the flaws in the instrument and kind of gotten in there and pulled that apart to discover some really quite unusual and sometimes harder edged sounds that I as a designer never intended in the first place, but which now are essentially inseparable from the identity of the instrument. And I mean there's loads of examples of that kind of thing throughout music history. I've heard said, although haven't verified for myself, that the key click on the Hammond organ wasn't a sort of design feature. It was a thing that existed, and that maybe Lee Hammond didn't like that so much, but now that's a part of the character of the instrument, so that's what we take it to mean. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that have happened. I mean, it's not all ambient music. I mean, there's been more jazz and rock influenced music. There's been some film scores. There's been some operas. I mean, it's quite varied.
Okay, let's look at Bela, because I say that's something I was most familiar with, over the past few years. It's kind of living in a space with a few other similar devices, like Mono have the Norns, which is a Raspberry Pi with a Super Collider engine and Lure on it. Cycling 74 now have Max generating code for the Pi 3. So they're working in a similar way. I guess the way I see Bela here is it's more kind of, in a sense, it's hardcore because it's low latency, designed for real high performance. And I guess that's because there's a lot of serious acoustic musicians who are kind of working with it and demand that. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story with Bela is twofold. One is that there should be no compromise in the performance of the system. That means extremely low latency, down to 1 millisecond round trip, which you're not going to get even on a high spec laptop. But it's not just that; it's also should be something that is immediately usable by people with widely varying technical skill levels. So it's not the kind of thing that you're going to have to be some kind of Linux gearhead to be able to understand how to write code for it. You can just you can run a PD patch on it. You can actually export Max Rainbow or Gen. You can export to Bela as well, and that code will compile. You can use Super Collider. You can use lots of different languages, and then we have lots of examples. There are tutorials. I mean, I've done like a 21 lecture YouTube series on C++ audio programming. And so the idea is that you shouldn't have to choose between tools that are immediately usable and tools that are performant. And I guess that's been the kind of mission from day one there.
Okay, so what's the kind of lineage of that? At what point did you decide, if I go and build a low latency, high performance box like this, that it's going to get picked up, and who's going to pick it up?
It kind of just grew organically out of originally the needs that we had in the Augmented Instruments Lab. I think if we had just sort of started out by saying, what is a hypothetical specification for something we'd bring to market, it would have been really hard to pull off. But what had happened is that I was working on a research project around 2013-14. It was around constraints in musical instrument design, and how the constraints encourage people to sort of appropriate and modify and push back at their instruments. And for varying reasons that I won't get into, we needed an embedded platform with a lot of those specs, with very low latency, with a kind of high bandwidth of input and output for analog and digital signals. And so I made the core code that later became Bela. And then what we found after that was that actually a lot of people in the lab needed something very similar for varying reasons. And so other PhD students in the lab started picking it up for their work. A number of them became active contributors to the project, adding lots of features, including the browser-based IDE that is now kind of one of the main features of the platform. But this was still all internal at the time. And then we started kind of working with a slightly wider network of external collaborators, still through mainly academic networks or independent artists. And then it was probably about 2-3 years after I started that we thought, this is ready more for prime time, and we ran a Kickstarter campaign in 2016, and that it kind of took off from there. So I guess it was one of those things where having identified a set of features or a certain set of challenges to be overcome, we discovered then that actually lots and lots of people had very similar things that they were looking for, and I think that's what has helped establish Bela out there in the community.
Okay, so maybe the kind of the secret sauce, as it were, was that you started out in an environment of smart academic practitioners who could kind of take this thing and really kind of work with it, and that kind of sustained it to a kind of critical mass.
I mean, I guess one of the things that is nice about academics is that you can direct your activities toward things that I think are kind of difficult, tough nuts to crack sometimes, and that you can spend some time really working through those without worrying about whether it's going to produce a marketable product, next month. But I didn't set out to do this as a commercial product, really. But then, ideally, anything in academics as well as anywhere else is that it should have some sort of real impact. It should make a difference to how how people design things, how people think about things, how people make music. And I guess in a way it was. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time in terms of needing certain things that turned out to be fairly common across the community.
Okay, so to clarify, you've got an Augmented Instruments Laboratory and also an Augmented Instruments Limited. So have you got like a research arm and a commercial arm? Is that the way it's working?
I suppose you could think about it like that. So Augmented Instruments Limited, the company, it's a UK company, and that was set up to commercialize Bela. So Bela is the kind of the original and kind of main product line of Augmented Instruments Limited. Although now we've also gotten more into touch controllers and into modular synthesis. So for example, one of the things that the company is doing is a Eurorack module called Gliss, which is a capacitive touch controller for your modular synth. So basically, you can kind of draw waveforms on it or control CVs directly from your fingertip. So I mean, that's all under the umbrella of the company. The Augmented Instruments Lab is basically a team of people located at the moment across 2 universities, across Imperial, where I am now, and Queen Mary in their Center for Digital Music, where a number of the PhD students in the lab are still completing their degrees. And so I mean, it's not the kind of thing where all the research in the academic side automatically ends up over at the company. I mean, the name, I guess, was shared because we envisioned that the company might do more things than just Bela, as indeed it has. But there is, we're certainly on friendly terms.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to do a quick name drop here of Laurel Pardue, because she's a violinist, and I actually shared a stage with her many years ago, and she's using Bela with her constructed violin. She's now Ableton, I believe, or was last time I checked.
Yeah, she still is, and I saw her just recently, and so I mean, her work is amazing, and she's an incredibly good musician as well. So she did a PhD and postdoc in the lab, and there, and then also at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, she developed this instrument which is called the Svampelin, It's a kind of hybrid acoustic electronic violin, which essentially decouples the string vibrations from the body of the instrument, but in a way that you can sense them then with pickups, and then sort of inject sound into the body of the violin. And what that means is that between the sensors and the actuator, you can stick some kind of digital sound processing. And what kind of thing do you need for that? Well, you need multi-channel, you need low latency, and naturally Bela is what we chose to work with for that. But it's a fun project, and one that I think we'll see continue to evolve.
And I guess that's a good example of why you need something like Bela to have lots of sensor inputs and outputs and very low latency, because if you didn't have that performance, then that kind of work just would not be convincing or would not work at all.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has really been impressed upon me is that there's a big gap between kind of being able to describe something in words, like I want to measure this and then I want this to happen, and like really being able to do that to a level of detail and nuance that really makes it just kind of intuitively work as a performer, as a musician. And there's loads of stuff out there. There's loads of tools out there that you can read some sensors, you can send a message through a USB cable to the computer, and then it can synthesize some sound in response. And that's fine. That works. That describes a valid musical system. But there's a big difference between that as a kind of low sample rate, kind of sluggish, jittery sort of interaction, and something that is just like absolutely there and immediate, to the point that you'd almost believe that there was no digital processing at all. And it's not that Bela is the only way to do that. Of course, you can build a lot of platforms if you engineer them that way to give you that kind of performance. But I think it's just about, for me, it's about thinking about those kinds of value sets early on and figuring out what do you actually need your technical tools to do for you.
Yeah, I guess. If I was to kind of do my old studio engineer grumble here, if you look at things like latency on DAWs, it's actually quite high. And somehow, we're looking at things that say, latency 20 milliseconds. And you think, nah, you can feel that. What will be lost here?
Absolutely, you can feel these things. And what's interesting, we studied this too. We did a study with a percussion, kind of a simple digital percussion instrument. This was Robert Jack who led this work, and he's now working for Bela. But we were looking at, do people notice latency, and how much latency does it take for people to notice? And it had been proposed by David Wessel decades ago that the answer was something around 10 milliseconds, and our study more or less confirmed that. But what was really interesting was that there was a sense where people's perception of the quality of the instrument degraded with latency, even before anybody really kind of noticed that latency was what was happening. And so it's like, at some level, there's something just kind of intuitive going on here. Is this thing like kind of right there under my fingertips, or do I feel kind of detached from it a little bit?
Mm-hmm. So let's wrap up. Let me throw a slightly speculative question at you. If we were 5 years on from now having this kind of conversation or talking about these things, where do you think we'd be? So if you kind of think forward, what's our next stages, and what do you think's on the horizon?
Well, I guess, future prediction is always hard. The obvious thing that that everybody, I guess, would say, and I would say too, AI is obviously, it's not that it's on the horizon. It's that it's here now, and generative models that are producing sound and music are a thing that is unsettling a lot of established practices. I probably don't have a lot of greatly original things to say about that, except to say that basically this idea that new tools come along and destabilize old working patterns is something that's basically as old as tools. And so surely creative musicians will find some ways to work with these things, at the same time as everybody's going to grapple with all the economic forces that they've always grappled with, which tends to commodify artistic work. And it's this perpetual push and pull. What I'm hoping for, I suppose, closer to the work that I'm doing, is that the digital and the kind of physical worlds don't need to remain as sort of separate universes, and in some cases even as separate aesthetics. I think that one thing that the advancement in computing power can do for us is not just more computations per second, but it's actually better I/O. It's that you have a richer link better sensors and actuators, more channels, more resolution, what have you. And if you use that sensibly, then I think there's ways that we could design instruments where they have physical components, they have digital components, but they don't need to be kind of walled apart from one another. And to somebody just making music with them, then, I think it should be an enriching experience where you don't kind of have to choose which of those sides of the divide you want to sit on. So I think 5 years is actually a reasonable time horizon to see some things start to change there. But, 10, 15, 20 years, who knows?
Indeed. Well, thanks so much for talking to us, and maybe in 5 years' time we'll come back and do it again and see how close we were in our predictions. Yep, super, really interesting. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes page for this episode, where you'll find further information, along with web links and details of all the other episodes. Oh, and just before you go, let me point you to the soundonsound.com/podcasts website page, where you can explore what's playing on our other channels. This has been a Project Casio production by me, Nick Rothwell, for Sound on Sound.